find out about our conference, which is coming up in November and which promises to be not a conventional academic conference, so all sorts of contributions are welcome. So my colleague, Prof. Moletsani, will introduce the panelists, but just to say for now that this is a room full of powerful virtual voices, the panelists I'm speaking about. And hopefully we will spend a lot of our time listening. There will be a Q&A session afterwards for about 20 minutes to half an hour, but please use it for succinct questions and comments. And also obviously feel free to use the chat. Lebo and I will be facilitating and we'll keep an eye on that. Let me just say a few quick words about framing the panel. I've asked for speakers to speak broadly to the issue of African women and food knowledges. And the key aim really is to explore the position knowledge of women in terms of the insight into what we eat, how we cook, and what relationships we establish with the natural world as the source of our food. In other words, to explore knowledge that is very different from the corporate neoliberal world of food, including the so-called Green Revolution, as well as the seemingly progressive voices of, for example, the food security and food justice movements. Food justice movement is sometimes just as guilty of speaking down and drowning out. Because often these expert knowledges provide a frame for instructing African women who are the primary food producers, the growers, the cooks, the feeders, while their own standpoint knowledge is reduced to instinct or seen as atavistic or as irrational, as pre-modern and so on. I just want to say by way of concluding this, that in a recent and stunning talk a few days ago, Pat Mcfadden, our first speaker, spoke about the fact that the most exciting feminist voices are not simply claiming identities or defining their difference in relation to the West or in relation to patriarchy. They are developing epistemological interventions and shaking up how we think about freedom, the apparent truths that we have come to live by, such as nature versus the ascendant human, or the idea that ecological resources are limitless, and our only challenge is to find better extractivist ways of using these, or the idea that humans must inevitably encounter nature and animals as adversaries, which must be killed and destroyed for humans to thrive. So these are the sorts of epistemological provocations that we are very much looking forward to in this panel. So let me now pass over to my colleague, Lebo, to introduce each speaker as she speaks.
Okay, so first up we'll have Pat Mcfadden, of course. Pat Mcfadden is one of the region's leading feminists and has written widely on feminism and nationalism, customary law, sexualities, radical feminism, feminism and epistemology, the list goes on. She is the founder of the feminist journal, Southern African Feminist Review, Safia. A sociologist by training, she takes a keen interest in the everyday and has written numerous essays for African and US-based publications on contemporary political struggles under neo-colonialism and neoliberalism. She has taught internationally at such universities as Spelman University in Atlanta in the US and at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa, and has also held numerous fellowships and visiting professorships internationally. Notably, Pat has consistently combined her intellectual work with activism and currently invests much of her energy and time in living and working as an eco-feminist. As a vegan, she has also sought to connect her personal practice to her intellectual and political quest for new ways of being human. I hand over to you, Pat. Thank you so much for honoring us.
Thank you, my sister. I wish you could see me because I can see all your gorgeous faces. But you know, I live in a dictatorship, and my computer has been hacked. In spite of having McAfee running, so clearly the regime has more superior malware. Of course, it's military extracted. We have a massive US embassy here, and no doubt one of the payoffs is to give them the latest military, the violent technology of the US military to use against us for surveillance. So I acknowledge, I know why my camera and my video system and my laptop actually was down. I'm trying to rebuild it. It's very difficult to have access to the skilled people who can assist me to rebuild my camera, especially because I just got a notification that my camera is occupied by several apps. So clearly, and these are the malware that is used. So it's an issue that we really need to talk about. The ways in which radical feminists in particular experience state surveillance, and which is linked with the precarization of radical women, that we are pushed onto the margins and over the margins so that we cannot function. So even if they don't actually incarcerate us and put us in cages, they make it virtually impossible for us to operate. But, you know, the resilience of radical feminist agency is so amazing, so, and indomitable. And that's what I'm bringing to this moment. And my conversation is going to speak very quickly. Oh, by the way, Lebo, how many minutes do I
have? Desiree, how many minutes does the chair speaker?
You have about half an hour, but it's flexible, so don't feel
marvelous. Yeah. Well, thank you. So it's 2:17. So I'll just time myself. So what I would like to speak to are 4 points. I will try to be as succinct as possible, so that we can have a deeper, wider conversation that's more participatory, because I live here on this mountain by myself and I miss the voices and the knowledges of my sisters. So an opportunity like this is just so special and precious to me. And I'm open to learn, to grow, to feed myself, and to experience the pleasure of radical intellectual ideas. So I'm going to speak to 4 points. I'm going to situate my ecofeminism because this is what I do in my new feminism. I bring my subjectivities to the discursive space. And I'm going to situate my ecofeminism in the context of Southern Africa as a site of white racist settler colonialism and a black male sort of inherited neocolonialism. So I'm doing an intersectional sort of critique without actually speaking to intersectionality in structuralist terms. But I want to situate myself, my Black female body, my identities as a woman who strives for freedom, and as a vegan and as an organic farmer. I'm going to try to blend those, to weave them into the conversation that I'm going to offer this afternoon. I'm also going to speak to women as agriculturalists, because that's who we are. We are the first scientists, we are the first inventors in all human societies, particularly in African societies. We are the first geometrists and mathematicians. We are the ones who we are the sites of knowledge. And so I want to speak to women agriculturalists at the interface of feudal and white settler patriarchal infrastructure, because this is where the majority of us are positioned. We are positioned in that place since the moment of colonization, where feudal patriarchy has colluded and adapted itself to the the hegemony of white settler colonial patriarchy. And then I will speak to the notions and meanings of food versus commodity production, which for me is garbage, and the violence that is imposed on Black bodies, particularly those of Black women, which have become mining sites through disease, so-called lifestyle diseases, so-called chronic conditions, and the violence also that has been extended since the moment of human accumulation, of class accumulation, since that moment onto all living and sentient beings, women being actually the first commodity that emerges in that moment of the invention of male power. And finally, I'm going to speak very quickly to the imagining of the alternative, the vegan, organic, and recalibration of our lives through the multiple dimensions through which we experience freedom. I'm going to try and speak quickly. It's a lot. And I hope you will bear with me because, like I say, these moments are just moments for me to actually just, wade into pleasure. Okay, I'm going to remain close to the mic. Am I good now? Does it sound good? Okay. So
Yes.
So by situating my ecofeminism, I renamed myself. Those of you with whom I have traveled, you may have noticed that over the 40 or 50 years that I have lived my feminism and restructured it and articulated it and all those little nuances that make up Patricia and her politics. I've been renaming myself, and I've traveled from being a nationalist situated in anti-colonial struggles, worker struggles 40 years ago, to this moment where I'm a contemporary feminist. And my contemporary feminism right now takes the form of an ecological feminism that is situated in my lifestyle as a vegan and organic farmer. Connected, of course, to all the women who dream of freedom through this particular form. And I'm situating it in the context of the political economy of Southern Africa as a settler colonial agrarian formation. And this is because, as Des was alluding, she was alluding to, the conversation that we had a few days ago was sort of like a moment of insight and awakening for me, like a touching base with the sources of energy, of women and Black people's energy or resistance energies that have fed my own experience of resistance, struggle, and reimagining of myself. And it's the idea of Southern Africa, and that's where I'm going to remain. Although in many ways, what I'm going to say, it applies to the continent because we are Black women across this continent. So, but I just want to situate myself more closely in the region because this is the region of settler colonialism, which is a very specific experience of capitalist violence through whiteness. And many of the dimensions, many of the expressions of resistance that we have grown up in and with reflects the hegemony of this white racist colonial system. And one of the things that I'm trying to do is to disrupt that hegemony, to step away outside of this paradigm, that the ways in which we think and feel about ourselves and who we have become are so deeply epistemologically marked and defined by whiteness. I'm not saying that whiteness no longer exists. Of course, that would be just an absurdity. But what I'm saying is that heuristically, conceptually, this moment of becoming contemporary and enables us to lean back, to actually reposition ourselves outside and beyond the discourses, ways. They are old. But also, even when we look at them, we can see that they sort of tether us to a particular narrative about ourselves, which, in spite of being radical and left, is deeply male, and which obfuscates and hides many of the nuances that we need to excavate so that we can, stimulate the shift in our own thinking and in our activism and in our embrace of the alternative as we craft it. So I'm bringing that to my ecofeminism, the political economy of our region. And I'm inspired very much by Silvia Federici's return to her earlier work and the link that she's making between wage labor, the male worker, and the disciplining of women and the extraction of women's labor without valuation, without remuneration, and without acknowledgement that actually women's lives are central to the reproduction of capitalism. So and in the left, we often speak of the dialectic, but we often think of the dialectic actually in linear terms. And what I'm trying to do is to draw from these radical traditions, but to reinterpret the dialectic in more mobile ways, in more flexible ways, and also in more non-conformist ways. So while I return to the left traditions that speak to contradiction and motion through contradiction, I'm also returning to sort of a revisioning of the narratives so that we can open them up and see where the new conjunctures lie. And for us, as political economists who speak to ecofeminism in new ways, land and Black women's labor in the narrative of feudal and capitalist systems of production and exploitation is deeply problematical. Why? Because the very imaginary of what land is and what Black labor is configured in a relationship with capitalism and with white settlerism that locks us into a very linear understanding of it. So to disrupt that, we have to ask certain types of questions. Those questions are linked with rejecting the construction of capitalist production as superior and the designation of subsistence, which is what women have done ever since the moment of human social formation. That women's work in subsistence is inferior and backward. We need to disrupt that conceptually, because then we can understand the ways in which those discourses and those lexicons that of course travel from Europe and are embedded in our lives through the imposition of capitalism as a dominant social formation. Those discourses actually deny us the conceptual and intellectual understanding of how powerful and valuable and knowledge-laden women's lives have always been and continue to be. Because if you think about it, it's a binary, and it's a deliberately created binary that positions Black women in particular as outside the scope of knowledge. We say this, we know it, we have repeated it, but how about if we interrogate it and then ask what have the consequences been for us as radical women who insist on speaking for ourselves and speaking new truths to our own power. So the construction of capitalist production as superior must be disrupted particularly for us as activists, as we form women's organizations, rural women's organizations that challenge the constitutions of countries like South Africa, for example, which claim to be inclusive, but which persist in narrating Black women as invisible, as non-subjects, and therefore as not legitimate claimants to citizenship and to access to the resources of that society, for example. So we also have to disrupt the construction of women's labor as marginal and natural in the reproduction of capitalism and of capital. And this discourse that has positioned Black male labor as the labor that is exploited and therefore invisibilizes women's labor. So, for example, the notorious expression by Ruth, I think it was, that Black women were superfluous appendages. Now, we felt really insulted. I mean, I remember it was like a visceral experience for me every time I used that expression, every time I critiqued it, you know, it was like, yes, something happened to my soul. Every time I read it or I wrote it, there was a deep anger that accompanied that expression, and legitimately so. However, what the white man was saying was actually a reflection of how settler colonialism constructed and invisibilized women's labor so that we as intellectuals did not ask the pertinent questions in terms of how that labor was a critical resource for settler colonialism and for the extraction of value and for the creation of these obscene lifestyles that whites in Southern Africa have continued to enjoy. So even in this contemporary moment, people say things like, oh, South Africa is the most unequal society in the world. You know, it's so cliched and it's so deeply disrespectful. But we say it because within neoliberalism, cliches are the norm, but they serve a particular function in that they destabilize and they mute and they suppress the critical thinking of Africans. So it becomes a normative expression, you know, accompanied by a certain sense of outrage, but a useless, futile outrage, because the actual critical intellectual rigor of the term is lacking. So we have to critique this construction of Black women's labor and Black women's bodies as marginal and natural to the reproduction of capital and to the Black family. And central to the Black family, on the other hand, which is, of course, owned by Black males. And it takes us to the point that Sylvia is making, because we often think about the wage in terms of white industrial societies. We don't actually extend the notion of the wage and its function in capitalism to settler colonialism, settler capitalist formations like that of those of South Africa, and the fact that it functions in exactly the same way. Just as the white working class housewife is exploited in particular ways by capitalism within British society, so also the Black woman in the rural spaces of Southern Africa continues to be exploited in exactly the same ways, reproducing labor so that Black men can earn a wage, which of course serves a particular function for capitalist accumulation. And often we cannot explain the violence that men unleash against women, especially Black men against Black women, unless we link it to the positioning of Black men within capitalist exploitation and the function of violence, which of course is linked to the disciplining of women in the household and the hierarchies of power that capitalism and patriarchy sustain and reproduce. So another point for me in terms of thinking about food, because before we arrive at the concept of food and how it is disrupted and distorted by capitalism, we need, I think, to understand that the context of what is now called food and food scarcity and poverty and hunger, which are liberal terms that are deeply problematical as well. We need to also understand that with the imposition of capitalism, there was a disruption of feudal, pre-capitalist agrarian systems through the extraction of Black labor. Most of us know this, it's called the migration system. And there was an emphasis in the discourses of resistance to the traumatization and the disruption and the dislocation of Black men as males, as fathers. You can hear it resonating in the conversations about fatherhood, for example, that you hear on radio, and also this obsession, this recent obsession with Black men who are talking about their masculinities and their sexualities and their children and all that. It's a backlash, but it's a backlash that's directly linked with discourses of marginalization and minimalization and vilification of women and their work and their bodies that are embedded in the very infrastructures of capitalism and of neocolonialism. And side by side with these established narratives of Black male emasculation, quote unquote, is a romanticization of rural life, the narratives of culture and psychological retrieval, for example, and yearning for a past life, centered on a notion and articulation of male loss. And you can hear it, for example, in Caiphas Semenia's music. I left my wife and I left my cattle, and I will return one day to my life and my cattle and my land. And you hear it in Huma Segela's famous train song, the men who think about their wives as they live in those rat-infested, flea-infested, hostels of Johannesburg. So, and this is really relevant, beautiful music, cultural gifts that these musicians give us. But they're very centered on the idea that colonialism was about Black men and white men struggling over power and over land and over the bodies of Black women. And yet, the discourse about Black women remains one of us being these helpless, passive, victimized humans who are relegated to the far reaches, unseen sites of our societies. So for me, these narratives show how feudal patriarchy adapted itself to colonial patriarchy and created a collusionary relationship that actually gave rise to new systems and practices of surveillance over women in feudal landscapes. And these surveillance systems, these practices have become consolidated and fossilized into what is called culture, but also they provide the bedrock for the neocolonial state to perpetuate systems of patriarchal privilege and exploitation and extraction of women's labor as it feeds capitalism in this moment. So we need a new scrutiny of the notion and experience of migration, which centers women epistemologically and ontologically in the ideology and implementation of settler colonialism and neocolonialism. We have to bring settler colonialism and neocolonialism back to the conversation about what happened to food, what happened to nurturing? Why? Why is it that we are feeding on garbage? And it has spread right across into the deepest reaches of our societies. And this idyllic notion that the rural spaces have food that is nutritious, they're very questionable. And we need to ask the question so that we can really see the landscapes and map them. I'm going to just read now. We also have to ask, how did women resist the patriarchal strategies that came out of the collusion between feudal patriarchs, and white settler capitalism? And we need an in-depth dimension of women's struggles within heteropatriarchal families of absent males, and the imposition of new hierarchies and forms of violence and discipline that women experienced in the moment of capitalist economic and political construction. And we need to get beyond the bemoaning of a lost past, which obscures the actual realities of how power and relationships of exploitation were perpetuated through a language that draws from nationalist nostalgia and white liberalism. Talk of poverty, of altruism, of rescue, and the inevitability of cultural incarceration. Inevitability. It's almost as though we can't escape the cage. We need to understand that colonialism was also about the agency of Black men in the adaptation of African patriarchy to the hegemony of white male patriarchal dominance. And very quickly, we also, and how that adaptation translates into a collusion represented by neocolonialism and the non-resolution of the land question in left language. The land question, which is fundamentally about women's lives and existences. The notion and meaning of food and of sustenance. That the ascendance of white commodity agriculture through the plunder of arable land in particular, and the extraction of Black labor, male and female, results in the imposition of junk, garbage as food for Black people and domesticated beings like cattle, pigs, etc. If you look at what is it that is consuming maize, for example, which is so dominant and so destructive in this region, you know, it's white commodity agriculture, and they claim, when they speak in resistance to the reclamation of land, for example, they claim that they are the only ones who can feed us, that if they do not continue to feed us with garbage, we won't be able to do anything for ourselves. And they always refer to Zimbabwe. They claim that after they left Zimbabwe, you know, Zimbabweans starved. So there are many reasons why there's a food crisis in Zimbabwe. Large part of it is that the elites who inherited the colonial state in Zimbabwe did not restructure the colonial state. They did not have the courage to make the necessary fundamental changes, not only to the state, but also to the land infrastructures, the relationships of power that had been imposed upon the land, that had excluded women in particular. So across this region, there is a white settler backlash discourse that imposes the white man as the determinant of our lives, and which we are, of course, disrupting by imagining and discussing and crafting the alternative. But you see, African people, we the African people, and the pigs and the cattle and all those who have been domesticated through coercion and violence, we are the ones who are consuming commodity agriculture. And you can see it as the alternative emerges. White elites in particular have appropriated, you know, this shift, and they are creating those markets, those unique and specialized markets that are exclusionary, where there is organic food which is healthy, because they want to live a long time and they don't want to die with the diseases that are completely destroying Black bodies. So the artificial inflation of prices of nutritious, non-pesticide, clean food that is healthy, it's a deliberate strategy to perpetuate the exclusionary characteristics of what has happened to food in this region. So the centrality of violence in the character of garbage as food, for example, the production of GMOs and hybrids, is really important in terms of critically thinking about the issues that confront us as we talk about food. The use of growth hormones and the trauma associated with growth hormones and its destruction of the Black body is also very central to this. The connections between commodity agriculture and big pharma, so-called lifestyle diseases, and the pandemic of inevitability, because blood pressure, high blood pressure, diabetes, rheumatism, all these things, I mean, leaky gut, it's all linked to the infrastructures of capitalist violence, coercion, and extraction from Black bodies. And of course, the mining of Black bodies as the new capitalist enterprise. And you can see it in the advertising, in the new forms of entrepreneurship. So women's resistance and struggles are foundation stones of feminist freedom, you know? And we can see this in the discussions, in the reclamations of food. For example, the protection and propagation of biodiversity, especially through the collection of seeds and the protection of healing plants and of seeds. And across our region, we can see collectives of women, courageously finding ways to protect indigenous seeds, and governments systematically pushing the so-called Green Revolution, which of course is a diabolical project aimed at flattening the landscape of food production and just feeding us this rubbish. So we are resisting at that interface.
Yeah,
Women.
So sorry, Pat. Could you conclude in the next 2 minutes? Yes, thank you.
Yes. So out of this, we draw a new meaning and a new recognition of the notion of resilience as central to the alternative imaginaries that are emerging within all women's communities that are centered on women's agencies of life. Feminism must retrieve and reclaim this notion of resilience from normative discourses of capitalist globalization, which are appropriating and distorting its meanings, including terms like ecosystems, which are now corporatized. So you hear corporates talking about ecosystems, this appropriation of language coming out of the environmental movement and the ecofeminist discourses. So here we have glimpses of the emerging alternative to capitalism through food production and pleasure, veganism, and a rejection of the reactionary backlash that is elitist. When people tell us it is elitist, we must engage them. Enables us to re-imbue notions, feminist notions of integrity, of resilience, of pleasure and dignity. And of course, it's about taking back our lives, taking back our beautiful Black bodies, nurturing them, protecting them from all the violence that accompanies the pesticides and the garbage. So let me end there so that I'm not the only voice here, and we are in a situation of war. Of course, we are always in a situation of war as radical women, and it has now entered the virtual space in very serious ways. Yeah. But thank you, my sisters. Thank you. We cannot stop them from, allow them to stop us from speaking our truth.
Indeed, Pat. I think I should go straight to the second speaker. Keep noting your comments and your questions in the chat box, and we will come back to them. Sorry, Pat, about that, and apologies, everybody. The creeps keep on creeping. We have our second equally fascinating speaker, Yvette Abrams, who is an ecofeminist and farmer based in Cape Town. Her historical research on Sarah Baartman is well known and is widely cited by feminists globally. as is her work on how climate change is connected to capitalism and racism. As a former commissioner for gender equality, the CGE, and a consultant for several NGOs, Yvette has also produced numerous policy-oriented writings, and her intellectual work continues to straddle the NGO, activist, and academic spheres. Yvette began her writing and activist work around climate change and ecology many years ago, at a time when very few South African feminists addressed this issue. Her path-breaking work strongly informs practical and intellectual efforts to pursue ecological justice, as this connects reciprocity and equality within and among the social and the environmental spheres. Over to you, Yvette. We hope to have gotten rid of the creep for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Pat, for that paper. Not just that paper, but all the many, many words that you have written that lay such a sound basis for those of us who come after you. That was amazing. And I think the ancestors must have been speaking to you, because it ties in so closely with my paper in so many different ways. When Desiree proposed this seminar to me, I said to her, you know what, I want to write about Sizani and Ngubane. And in this very personal way, approach many of the themes that Pat alluded to. Now I'm in tears already and bound to get worse as this paper progresses. So I'm really happy to be in the company of sisters, because I know that you will support me through this. Now I'm a third generation genocide survivor, and you know, in a way, the past 2 years, I've been really happy that I have this ancestral memory and culture about how to survive enormous loss. You know, my cousin the other day, she said to me, you know what, Yvette, I'm just really burnt out on grief. I don't have any left. And I think all of us who are mourning in these times get that feeling. You know, when you go through these times of enormous loss, then you cut down to basics. I really don't have space for hatred or anger or sorrow or grief, because most days I wake up in the morning, I say, Yvette, are you breathing? Yes. Okay, you don't have problems. And I focus on what needs to be done for survival. And I guess it's an indication of the way I'm coping that I'm ready to start the sorrow work. It is such huge emotional labor, and you know, I really appreciate all of you, that Des for inviting me, and Pat for laying the basis, and all of you that are here supporting me. At first I wanted to burn Khoikhut and Pepo, and then I said, okay, no. But trying to, as you know, I'm engaged on this project of how do you practice indigenous knowledge systems in academic spaces. So in one sense, this is a very straightforward honoring of Sizani, but trying to write it and speak it in ways that draw on the underlying themes that Des is asking us to think about. So for those of you who didn't know Sizani, and there are many others here who knew her, who I hope will join me later in question time with the memories. She was just simply an outstanding Black woman. I mean, she received so many prizes and so many awards, but really you had to know her. You had to know her to realize the kind of person she was. She shifted worlds. She moved power in such deep and fundamental ways. I myself first met Sizani, I think it must have been late 1990s or early 2000s. I distinctly remember the National Land Commission's workshop on women and land, which I facilitated, and Sizani's inputs there from the rural women's movement, and the very real head-to-head we went there with the men in the the many men, not all, many men in the National Land Committee around this notion that women have a right to land. Now that's as late as 2001. I mean, you would think, but it was what it was, and it was such a delight to me to meet such a staunch comrade, because really most of the time you just sat back and let Sizani do the talking. The NLC fell apart shortly after that. I don't want to say it's related to women and land. There were many reasons why, but Sizani and I became lifelong friends and carried on working together in various spaces. And she was that kind of person. You know, you could have knocked me over with a feather when I was in a conference in Las Vegas in 2004. It was an international feminist conference on the gift economy. And who's there but Sizani? I'm like, hey, you know, fancy seeing you here. And she's like, of course, I go everywhere I need to go for Black women and land. And when she put it like that, well, obviously, she was there in 2004 pleading the cause of HIV/AIDS widows, and really did much to focus on my attention on the problem. You might not know, but at the time, the seropositivity rate, neonatal clinics were testing in KZN, and something like 29% of pregnant women tested HIV positive. So that gives you some idea of how KZN came to be the worst affected province. And yes, Pat, we can go deeply into the reasons around white supremacy and the migrant labor system and how KZN came to be in that position. But Sizani didn't waste much time on the root causes. She really just stood there in Las Vegas and said, here is this group of women. They're probably more, something like 40 to 50% of widows in KZN were bereaved before their time because of HIV. And what happens to them when their husband dies? You know, they're locked in this patriarchal system where land cannot belong to a woman. It has to go through a man, pressure put on them to marry their husband's brother or to operate through their son. And for those that had neither husbands, uncles, nor sons, you know, were really in a desperate position. And of course, sitting with innumerable grandchildren that they were having to look after, because often their children went before them. It was a desperate situation. And so Sizani pleaded and fought for them passionately. The history of the rural women's movement, I really hope there's a Zulu feminist or any feminist that is moved to write it, because it deserves its place in our history. And what did not help at this point was just as Sizani was starting to get some traction around the issue of the widows, the Ingonyama Trust Board decided to start charging rents on tribal trust land. It was somewhere in the early 2010s, although I've heard of cases as far back as 2005. Now, just to point out that the Ingonyama Trust Board is the single biggest landowner next to Anglo-American in the country. They own almost 30% of KZN arable land and rent out lots of it to things like mining and commercial companies and so on. And when it comes to companies, they don't ask who owns the company. But when it comes to you know, people who've been occupying the same piece of land for generations, that relationship is strictly gendered. When the Ingonyama Trust said, well, we're going to make everybody sign leases, women could not sign those leases. There's this famous case of one of the women who had to approach her partner, not the husband who died long before, but the current partner, to ask him to sign. And that's what was happening in KZN during the 2010s. And Sizani kind of just doubled down and said, this is wrong. This is not going to happen, and set up a case together with the Legal Resource Center in KZN, the Association for Rural Advancement, and some affected widows that were courageous enough to take on social disapprobation and to stand up for their rights. at this time I was at the CG, at the Commission for Gender Equality, and we were bit by bit chipping away against this neo-colonial rural patriarchy. I mean, I don't want to go into too much detail, but quite obviously the system of indirect rule was set up during the period of British colonialism in KwaZulu-Natal in the 1920s to the 1940s. And you know, it's no secret these days that what came to be codified as tribal traditional law was very patriarchalized compared to the previous gender egalitarian, informal, consensus-based self-rule that they had. As the British codified, they systematically distorted it in favor of men and literally denying women a place in the politics and the economics of the tribe that historically had been their right. So what she was taking on was very, very old forms of gender, but primarily racialized. I mean, it looks like gender. It looks like it's about Black men and Black women, but really it's about colonialism and white supremacy. And she took on all of this without fear. So to the extent that by 2017, I can remember getting a call saying that she was on the run and looking for a place for herself and her son. And the attacks on Sisizani's life, on her family safety, on her property, 2017 was a bad year. And we found her a place. I believe she was in the Western Cape for a while. But of course, being Sisizani, went back as soon as she felt reasonably safe. She went back to her house. And yeah, this very difficult part of her paper to talk about Sisizani's death, which I think in many ways tells a story as large as her life. She went to the hospital in December 2020 with her son, who tested positive for COVID. So he had to go into hospital, dropped her back at the house, and went into hospital. And he spent the next week or so calling as often as he could be sentient. I believe he was in ICU, but as often as calling police, calling ambulances, calling Department of Health, calling everybody saying, where's my mother's test results? She's alone at home. Somebody needs to go there and check that she's okay. And not a single authority in KwaZulu-Natal responding, not one. And I kind of get that it was December 2020, you know, a deep time in global history, when all our state systems were put under enormous pressure, but still, and I guess for certainly as long as I live, I will always ask myself, was there a connection between the harassment of 2017 and the fact that in 2020 nobody could come to her aid? And I've often asked myself, well, why didn't she call us? You know, we would have found a way, but knowing Sisizani, she would probably have said, I'm not going to put anybody else in danger. I mean, you all know, and I all know, that if she had called anyone, we would have sent food, we would have sent medication, somebody would have gone around there and cared for her, because that is the love that we had for her. But she didn't call a single person, and for that entire week she was alone. Her son eventually got out of hospital. He went home, he slept for a day, and the next day, a Sunday, he went round to her house and found her dead. And she'd been dead for some few days. And like I say, had not touched her phone or anything. So that was her death. But fortunately, you know, we are in Africa, and in African cosmology, she's not dead. She's multiplied. Her spirit is now somewhere else. And I could only think the last few months as I pondered this paper, I thought, yes, Suzanne is not going to rest in peace. She's not going to rest in peace until we have some justice for her. Just like Kwezi would not let us rest until we put a rapist in jail. So Suzanne is not going to let us rest until we hold those powerful accountable. So the memorial work, in a sense, is as always with comrades, deeply political. So it makes me happy and profoundly pleased to be able to say that this year, 2021, she finally found justice. The Pietermaritzburg High Court found the Ingonyama Trust Board guilty of contravening the Constitution and pointed out that our Constitution does not allow the charging of rent for tribal trust lands. It is quite simply and flatly illegal. And the sentence the trust to pay back all the money to all those widows that they have paid ever since 2011. And it's going to be a pretty sizable sum. So when you see Zulu patriarchs in tears in their Mercedes, it's probably soon going to have to be sold, it's because of Sisizane and all the many others who helped make that court case a reality. Now, like I said, the CGE, we've slowly been chipping away. We have, I think, to date about 5 constitutional court judgments, each one that says that, as you know, in the Constitution, there's a hierarchy of rights. Some rights are non-derogable and some are derogable, meaning we all have rights, but some rights cannot be tampered with. And they have repeatedly in these 5 judgments stated that the right to gender equality supersedes the right to culture and tradition. In other words, you're welcome to have your culture, you are welcome to practice it, but the point at which your culture requires you to practice gender discrimination, you are contravening the Constitution. So the Ingonyama Trust Board judgment takes its place amongst a long line of judgments. I don't know if they're going to appeal to the Constitutional Court. If they did, they don't have a sucker because the Constitutional Court consistently has upheld that gender equality is a non-derogable right. All the other derogable rights have to take second place to it, meaning if you are living, and this is the largest proportion of women agriculturalists today, if you are living in land that is falling under customary law, you do not need a man to sign for that land. You access it in your own right as a woman. You can leave your labor tenancy or your occupancy right to your daughter, who has equal rights to inherit as your son does. All of this has been laid out in constitutional jurisprudence. So you ask yourself, how did the highly educated accountants and lawyers of the Ingonyama Trust Board, which like I say is the second biggest landowner in the country, they've got lots of money, how did they miss this point? And I can only think of it as quite a deliberate blindness. To be quite frank, I say to myself, they wanted to provoke us. They wanted to see how far we were going to let this slide. And like I say, Sisizane did not let it slide. I mean, there were many other court cases and many other battles in the meantime. But I want to lay this Ingonyama Trust judgment as a wreath on her grave and to say, Sis, we honor you, and you know that we're never going to give up the fight until your goals are achieved, until the justice that you seek has been accomplished. I want to end off by saying, I think just a word for all our sisters and our feminist sisters and the people of KZN, that I think in a lot of ways, the laying to rest of this neocolonialism is what's going to bring peace. It's not a superficial or a temporary, this is not a battle over one man or one patriarchy. It's not as easy as pointing fingers at this official or that official and saying that has to be fixed. I think for me, we need to talk about a much deeper structural change, a transformation, a revolution in the way we view our relations to each other, and a returning to the gender egalitarian and the matriarchal practices of Zulu culture. I say this as a Khoisan, but I can't imagine that you know, how many times must we bang the patriarchs in court? At what point do they say, well, you know what, the British system of indirect rule is really not working. The system that is built, fundamentally built on the unpaid labor of Black women, cannot work in a modern constitutional democracy. You know, the other, of course, very famous court cases that Sizani were fighting were the Bantustan laws, as we call them, the modern day reinvention of customary that Parliament in fact passed, though it will never pass the Constitutional Court ever, which literally wanted to force rural women into a position where if you want land, you have to accept the tribal patriarchy. Literally giving up their citizenship rights in parts of the nation of South Africa. So yes, we await those Constitutional Court judgments when we'll be able to lay another wreath at Sizani's grave. But I think I'm going to end there. There are many who knew Sizani in this meeting who I'm sure would want to say something. So I want to leave some extra space during question time for us to grieve together. Thank you very much, sisters.
Thank you, Yvette. As you can tell, colleagues, if I try to editorialize, I will just be spoiling the very good presentations that have been made so far. So I'll jump straight to our next speaker, Meshia Andrews, who works as the co-director of the Trust and the Trust for Community Outreach, TCOE. Meshia has had a long and dynamic career as a radical activist, educator, and writer, and has authored numerous accessible publications on politics, the economy, and power relations, as well as numerous academic pieces in various journals and other platforms. She is the convener of the Rural Women's Assembly, a coalition of rural and peri-urban women from 9 African countries. Meshia is passionately committed to addressing the gendered implications of exploitative food practices and food producing system. Over to you, Meshia, and thank you again for honoring our invitation.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to all the sisters that have joined this gathering today. And Yvette, it was good to bring back strong memories of Sizani. I informally said to Desiree that I don't think I can start. I can't talk for all of us, but I don't think I can start today's meeting without commenting on what unfolded on our televisions and in the streets of Gauteng and Durban last week. So it's linked to the topic in a sense, in a very big sense, actually. So I think we were all glued last week to watching scenes of thousands of people going into supermarkets, coming out of the supermarkets with trolleys and baskets and bins, whatever could hold things. People came out of the supermarkets, the malls, with goods. They went in their thousands. And I think it's important to say that for a large majority, and it's also what is now been, what the insurance companies and the mall owners and so on are saying, is that vast majority of people that went into the shops, went into the food stalls and carried out trolleys, baskets, and whatever not with food. We saw a lot of that. I don't want to be sidetracked by the fact that there were those who came with bakkies and loaded all kinds of other things. I think I want us to zone in on the fact that a large number of people, the majority of people that went into the stores, expropriated food. And I'm using the word expropriated. I don't want to use the word that is being used at the moment. Everybody went in and looted. So I think I'm starting there because I think that it's not only in South Africa where we've seen this. I think we've seen there's been reports of what is called hunger riots in other parts of the world. There was some last year in May, there was a big similar situation to what we saw in Johannesburg and Durban, in Santiago, in Chile. There have been some similar protests as well in Nigeria and so on. And I think I want to make the point that we probably will see more of these kinds of explosions. And we're going to see more because global hunger is on the increase. And I think the pandemic that we've all experienced in the last period probably exacerbated the existing hunger, the existing food insecurity, the existing problems. And for me, the overlap between the pandemic, the deepening recession, crisis of unemployment, and the climate crisis in our region has certainly created a great deal of worsening conditions. Now, I'm also of the view that my mother used to always say this to us: hungry children are angry children. Hungry women and hungry men are angry people. And so we're sitting with a situation of growing frustration and growing anger. And I think we are going to have to really start with some of an element of what Pat said is where I want to zone into. We have a situation in our world and in South Africa and Southern Africa where we've seen in the last 30 to 40 years, Yvette probably has the statistics better than I do, but we've seen a growing centralization and corporatization and monetization of the food system. Few multinationals control the food system. We can name them. In South Africa, there are 6 supermarket chains, retail chains that own and control the supermarkets. The same with the production of food, etc. So the current food system that we have clearly is a food system that has failed us and will continue to fail us. We have seen this food system that I am describing, that we all know so well, built on the backs of the displacement of many, many small corner shops, small traders, informal traders, a community. I grew up, many of you in this room grew up in neighborhoods where there were several local food stores where we could access, have our food in a completely different way to what we are having and accessing food today. And it is this corporatized food system, the way in which people have been displaced, communities have been completely reorganized, and food has been, if you think of food today, you no longer think of the food, a fresh vegetable truck that used to come into our communities, or the fish truck that used to come into our neighborhoods bringing fish and food and so on. South Africa has been particularly corporatized. In some places in Southern Africa, there's still local food markets and open air fresh produce markets and so on. But in this country, it doesn't exist. And alongside, for me, of the displacement and the dispossession of land and the destruction of the local food systems and so on, has also been the grabbing of our lands, an attempt to grab all our knowledge, our seeds, our local food, etc., etc. So this, I think, has been under threat for a long time. And it's only in recent years that we have begun to build counter movements. And I want to talk a little bit about one of the counter movements, and that's the Rural Women's Assembly. And the Rural Women's Assembly has emerged across the region. Today, it's in 10 countries in the region, and it is a growing movement of ordinary voices of peasant women, small-scale farmers, producers, fishers, farm workers, etc. And this movement is committed. The slogan of the movement, I think many of you may know, it's "We are the guardians of land, life, seeds." They added oceans in 2019 and love. And love is about the violence that exists in our country. So the main objective of the Rural Women's Assembly is about reclaiming and reimagining an alternative and alternatives. And it started in very, very small ways. And the first part of what the Rural Women's Assembly attempted to do was to reclaim our food system and to start to talk about the foods that we eat and the foods that our mothers have cooked and that that's been in our communities for a long time. And so with that start of a conversation about reclaiming food, we produced a book, actually. I will lift it up. I should have made a slide, and the book is Food is Life. So this was a recipe book that women produced, the local recipes of the food that we cook, and the food that our mothers have cooked, and that's food that's been cooked in the region. And we started with food because I think it is, as Pat said, food is an expression of African women's relationships to each other, to family, to community, to nature, etc. And it's a complex relationship because in many ways it's a relationship where we are probably most exploited, where women are the producers of food. Large majority of them are still producing the bulk of the food. We are the makers of the food. We are the servers of the food. But it is also in many ways an expression of ourselves and a way of building community, building solidarity. So it's complex, but it is an expression of how we are. I know with my family, it's about when we cook, this is something we all like together, or this is what my mother cooked or my granny cooked, or etc. And this, I think, is why we started with reclaiming food, and to really take into the villages, into the communities, into the dialogues that we have, that we need to push back against the fast food movement, push back against food that is making us sick, etc. So this is one element. I don't have the time today to go into all of this, but reclaiming food, reclaiming the vegetables, the way in which African leafy vegetables was used long ago, all of that is an attempt to push back. So this is one aspect of what we do. Another important aspect, of course, you cannot be producers of food, and we encourage, because most of our members are farmers and peasants and fishers and so on, that we cannot begin to talk about food and reclaiming food if we do not push back and reclaim our territory and fight for land. So the fight for land is central to our struggle for alternatives. And for us, the issue of land is not simply about livelihoods. It's about our independence, because in many cases, women also link access to land, control over land, and the story, or the Mam Sazani's life was about giving women rights and control over their land in their own rights. And it's about independence. And we link it often to domestic violence, etc., because unless women have control over resources, unless they own land, they remain in very challenging relationships and so on. But access to land is also about belonging, where we come from, who we are, how we are defined. So this issue, again, is part of how we want to rebuild an imagination, a new relationship with land. Women, the Rural Women's Assembly say, we are nature. And so land and the oceans and our biodiversity is all part of that relationship to land. And then I think linked to that, another key aspect of what we attempted to do was to reclaim and assert and celebrate our knowledge. And Yvette has many wonderful stories to tell about this, and also Pat. But the issue of our medicinal plants, the knowledge of the medicinal plants, how we use it, and so on, is another important aspect of reclaiming and celebrating. And in that regard, we produced another little book called Herb with Life. And in there, we talk about all these, the herbs that we use, that is now during COVID become very popular. But for us, it's been an attempt, again, at building alternatives. And so this is, I think, another aspect. And here there are many, many aspects, because it's also about struggling over intellectual property. It's about struggling that communities don't lose control over many, many of their memories, of the knowledge, and of the resource that belongs to them. So this, I think, is a key part of what the Rural Women's Assembly also does. Linked to that has been a practice of how we use land, how we produce food, and that is to promote agroecology and to put agroecology at the center of all these aspects that I've just spoken about. So we cannot begin to separate building of alternatives, building of an alternative food system that is localized without having all these components of what makes a food system. And of course, the struggle for control over land, the struggle to promote alternatives, the struggle to push back. These are all parts of building resistance, building consciousness, and illustrating that we do have answers and that there are alternatives. So for us, the question of seeds, controlling seeds, advancing, or not advancing, but pushing back against the ways in which multinationals want to bring GMOs or the Green Revolution, all these aspects must be seen as integrated into a struggle for alternatives, so that part of what we do as we build a movement is to resist, but also create. Resist, push back, and create. So I want to end off by reading a poem that's part of the Rural Women's Assembly thinking. And the poem is called A Recipe for Change. This is a recipe for everyday use. However, it should be adapted to local conditions, local ingredients, patience, and a daily slow stirring for the best results. What are the ingredients? Heaps of active rural women in villages, communities, and local farmer associations. Large doses of committed, conscious leaders. Buckets of loud voices with clear demands. Clear platforms of action. Strong critiques of the system that oppresses and exploits women. Many kilograms of healthy rejections of patriarchy. Fresh ideas. Locally picked alternatives, bags of information and resources, bottles of alliances and partners. The method. This recipe requires slow and consistent work for best results. First, bring together all the ingredients in one district, one territory, and a region. Listen to the local voices and the local issues. Then add hands, feet, and heads that are full of motivations and ideas that believe they can solve their own problems and bring about change. Make sure all the ingredients consist of a mix of freshly picked young leaves and leaves that have withered, as well as leaves that have weathered many storms. Grease the baking pan. Pour in the mixture and cook slowly. Watch all the time. This is a slow cook recipe that has proven results. From time to time, you may have to turn up the heat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Meshia. That was really fascinating. And informative. I'm hoping that people are noting their questions and their comments in the chat box. Moving straight to our last speaker, Ruth Nyambura, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who is an ecofeminist activist based in Kenya. As an intellectual activist who takes the need for engaging audiences seriously, Ruth is extremely vocal on social media and other radical public platforms within and beyond Africa, using these platforms for her activism and other work. She is the coordinator of the Hands Off Mother Earth campaign and the African Ecofeminist Collective. Ruth is especially concerned with the connections between food and women's movement. She is committed to writing, organizing, mobilizing, and struggling in the interest of social justice and against exploitative and destructive food production, marketing, and selling. Welcome, Ruth, and thank you for coming to our webinar. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I've just had a proper chuckle when you said I'm very active on social media, considering I've spent the last year having deactivated most of my accounts, but I'll take it. Also, now I have moved on from Hands Off Mother Earth campaign, but if anyone is interested in being part of a global movement that opposes geoengineering technologies and other false solutions to the climate crisis, please do get in touch with me. So I'm just going to start. I know we are very short on time. Also, it's very difficult to be the last person to speak after listening to the presentations. It's something else. And someone has written on the chat, I love the fact that this is not just a conversation. There's a lot of emotion and care and tenderness that has gone into the presentations we've just had. So I just want to thank everyone for the co-creation and curation of this space, despite having Emilia try to take over the space, but failing very hard. So I will start off where Meshia ends by reading something by MSSR's A Tempest. Prospero, you are the master of illusion. Lying is your trademark, and you have lied so much to me, lied about the world, lied about me, that you have ended by imposing on me an image of myself. Underdeveloped, you brand me, inferior. That's the way you have forced me to see myself. I detest that image. What's more, it's a lie. But now I know you, you old cancer, and I know myself as well. That's the first one. The second one from the same Caliban, A Tempest. You think the earth itself is dead. It's so much simpler that way. Dead, you can walk on it, pollute it. You can tread upon it with the steps of a conqueror. I respect the earth because I know that it is alive. What do you think you've done without me in this strange land? I taught you the trees, fruits, birds, the seasons, and now you don't give a damn. Once you've squeezed the juice from the orange, you toss the rind away. MSSR's A Tempest, and that is Caliban. So I start my presentation in a very odd way because I've had to sort of rearrange it based on the three presentations that we've had. So it's going to be part presentation, part a summary of my presentation based on the conversation so that I do not repeat what we've just listened to. So we know obviously that these are perilous times for the African continent as a whole, battling the intersections of climate, energy, and food crisis, and now a health crisis, a pandemic that is problematically being treated as a security concern by not just African governments, but governments across the world. And we know that, importantly, when it comes to the politics of food, knowledge passed down from generation to generation over the years has revealed that before the colonial encounter, Africans had a rich and vast knowledge of their environment. And in many cultures, land, water, forests, and other natural resources were even deified and held in sacred common trust. The environmental commons were symbolically insured against abuse or pillage, and it was the forceful integration of the African environment into the world market through the instrumentality of the colonial state and unequal trade that laid it open to predatory extraction, disease, pollution, and degradation by external hegemonic forces. So we can authoritatively argue, and from the presentations we just had, that the ecologies inhabited by Africans today are both a reflection of and a result in many ways of the long histories and afterlives of global imperial pillage. Colonial exploits in the African colonies were violent and extractivist to both the local indigenous populations as well as the environment. Through this brutality and savagery, modern industrial economies of Europe and America were built on the structures of unequal trade and exchange of property, raw materials, which would become the backbone of today's modern economy. So it is crucial to state that the colonial ideas of development were not gender neutral, but were rather grounded in patriarchal notions of the supposed unproductiveness and backwardness of African women, and more so of their work in providing sustenance and ensuring survival of their families and communities. These views also capture the economic prejudices and beliefs against nature, as well as indigenous people that persist on the continent and globally to this very day. The civilizing mission for African women, indigenous peoples, and the commodification of nature that began in colonialism continues to thrive almost unabated in many of the government policies across the continent, as well as in mainstream development discourses being pushed by international financial institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, and of course, global North governments. So I'll be speaking to now around the narratives regarding the politics of food and feminism on the continent. So from the presentations that we just listened to, we see that the inequities and inequalities underpinning Africa's food and agrarian systems are distorted within neoliberal capitalist hegemonic narratives. And we find ourselves in a situation in which hunger and other manifestations of food insecurity, as they call it, are removed from their contextual roots. Interestingly, as Pat was just saying, the solutions proposed by private companies and foundations and organizations such as the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, AGRA, routinely fall into the category of techno-market fixes and also get problematically removed from the greater societal, political economy, ecological, and social cultural context which they propose to fix. In fact, they are routinely presented, the problems around food, the food question, are routinely presented as if this context that we've just mentioned do not exist in the first place. It's like there's a vacuum. The crisis emerges out of a particular vacuum with absolutely no structure or context to be spoken of. And we've also seen from the presentations that we also see the absolute importance of tracing the origins of the food, agricultural, agrarian crisis in Africa, from at least, for example, not just the colonial period, but from the last 50 years of neoliberal globalization, and the relevance it has to this particular times of increased food insecurity, the climate crisis, the agrarianization, the peasantization, and the emerging conflicts over natural resources. Epistemologically, we have seen the tensions and ruptures between two main schools of thought, which three presenters who've gone before me have talked about very clearly, right? So the two main schools of thought, which basically are around, the industrial agricultural policies being pushed on one hand, one supporting neoliberal market mechanisms as the key to solving Africa's food and by extension agrarian questions. And the second epistemology that not only challenges the hegemony and moral authority of the market, but firmly advocates for a way of knowing, world building, and solution making that actively listens to and centers localized decolonial knowledges. I personally and politically claim the term food sovereignty as a political project, as a utopia, as a way of knowing, as a way of seeing, despite its limitations, but personally and politically, it is a political project for me that I claim. And I speak to the present question about African feminisms and food by locating it in a question around food sovereignty. So food sovereignty itself remains unproblematized largely in a lot of the feminist literature around food and ecology. And most often it is simply taken at face value. So a central question remains for us as African feminists. How do we conceptualize, if we choose to, how do we conceptualize food sovereignty, number one, as an object of research when it comes to the process of knowledge building and knowledge making? So a useful suggestion in this case would be to consider food sovereignty as a project to conceptualize, a multidimensional political project. So as such, food sovereignty appears as an evolving imaginary of the future in which a collection of disparate movement actors are currently partaking. So the substantive content of this project, would vary in time and place, and according to the specificities of different movement actors involved. The movement actors may be academics, maybe activists, maybe fisherfolk, nomads, pastoralists, informal food traders in markets across the continent. So basically, this is one of the ways in which to conceive of a political project that intertwines, food rights, food justice, and the politics of African feminisms. So discourses about food sovereignty can also be seen as a site of meaning-making practices for African feminists. So the most significant of which, when you're studying women's and feminist mobilizations, as Mercia has spoken about, Southern African Rural Women's Assembly, and there are many more women's movements, for example, on the continent, working transnationally on the politics, the intersections of not just food, but the intersections of ecology. So thinking about this various women's movements and feminist movements, and linking these movements to other wider movements, whether it's workers' movements, queer movements, trans movements. So it doesn't become a movement that is silo, but rather a movement that takes into account the multiple ways and expressions and being of African women and African feminists on the continent. So this would move away from, the essentialized and traditional visions of women's feminist roles and act as a critical analysis of gendered relations and a space to establish feminist claims grounded in justice. And so in understanding food and feminism on the continent as a political project, we do this, by moving beyond a merely technical undertaking, So this allows us to engage in an analytics that pays attention to the discursive articulations, political practices, and political dynamics through which this project is and can be appropriated by other movements actors, as I just spoke about a few minutes ago. And this will enable richer and more detailed inquiries into the multiple manifestations and meanings of food sovereignty, noted not just in literature, but going back to the origins of food sovereignty, which emerges out of one of the most radical grassroots, not just grassroots, but peasant movements across the world. So thinking about cross movements and different actors, as just mentioned, around the politics of food and feminism, right? We can think, for example, within the feminist movement on the continent, how do movement actors such as pastoralists and nomads in Africa, or even fisherfolk, articulate food and ecological struggles within their own history and political ideas about what kinds of social relations are at stake and why? And on which basis do they proceed to articulate a politics of food rights, food justice, or even sovereignty, whichever they choose to, within existing elements of their own movement discourses and projects of social transformation that resignifies the need to be changed in the social relations of food production, distribution, and consumption. So how can we think about the politics of food and its intersection with feminism within the context of democracy, within the context of sovereignty, and challenge the various manifestations of heteropatriarchal capitalism as African feminists? So in conclusion, with all that said, I think it's important to, when we think about the politics of food and the particular time that we're in, the particular crisis, multiple and intersecting crisis that we're in, we have to think about a politics of solidarity, politics of what does it mean to move forward from here? What do we mean about justice? What does democracy, what does sovereignty in its fullness and liberation actually mean? So this is a call to carefully think about the possibilities when we think about a politics of food and a politics of feminism, radical feminism on the continent, is to think about the possibilities of anti-capitalism and decolonization. Again, not as hip slogans and metaphors, but by centering questions on land, for example, which Mercia has been very clear to articulate, which remains so important for so many people on this continent, and especially for indigenous people, and building power around the radical alternatives of peasant farmers, fisher folks, nomads, pastoralists, and even urban farmers, contesting elitist and privatized ideas of justice, and by working towards a politics of recovering memory and recovering a politics of the commons. And so these are just a few examples, working across what Benedict Anderson calls imagined communities, the potential of making political alliance as African feminists against oppressive power structures across divisive and often fluid boundaries, and that deep commitment to creating horizontal comradeship. So feminist scholar Chandra Mohanty, for example, takes these political concepts further by encouraging us to think about the possibilities of communities of resistance. How do we articulate a politics of radical feminism and a politics of radical conceptions of food justice on the continent without thinking about possibilities of communities of resistance? So these are different groups of people connected together, not by essentialist notions of their struggles, no cultural or biological basis for alliance, but rather connected by the political links that they choose to make about their lives and their struggles. And in this case, around the struggles for food. So it's about thinking about power. How do African feminists working on the intersections of ecology and food justice think about power? Secondly, we must rethink our relationships with one another. And I think that Yvette has been very careful and tender to enable us to think about that. What are our relationships with one another? We must rethink that, to believe strongly, to act clearly, and to build structures that reject the idea that we are disposable, that the earth and nature, which we are part of, are merely things to be exploited and desecrated. And ultimately for me, as an African feminist, a decolonial and anti-capitalist, within decolonial and anti-capitalist feminist movements for climate justice boil down to one word: solidarity. What does solidarity look like to me as Nyambura? What does solidarity look like to the communities that I choose to be in solidarity with every single day? And one of my favorite quotes about solidarity is actually from the Sandinistas. And it says that solidarity is an expression of the people's tenderness. And to finish off, I conclude with the words of Ella Baker and Bernice Regan-Johnson. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. And finally, by Molara Ogundipe Leslie, African women must theorize their own feminisms. And I was thinking about that as I was preparing for this discussion, but also thinking with Patricia, thinking with Yvette, thinking with Mercia. The kind of work and the kind of beauty that we've listened to has been an exercise in African women theorizing their own feminisms. And in this case, a feminism that centers ecology and centers food. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruth, for ending the panel with those powerful words. I'm conscious of time, so I will hand back to my colleague Desiree. Des?
Yeah, I just had a quick word on the side with Lynn, who directs us about what we need to do. And she said that we can take an extra 15 minutes because we're now on 4 o'clock, for comments and conversation. So far, I must say that for me, what was wonderful was the way that the conversation started with Pat and the unmapping, and then the focus, and then ended with Ruth's kind of bringing it back. It was wonderfully structured, inadvertently. But we can now take some comments and questions. There was one in the chat. So if people have to leave, I understand. I think it came from Vanessa. And Vanessa wanted to know, and I assume, Vanessa, do you want to just say this question yourself, Vanessa? Is she there?
Hi, Desiree. No, I was just concerned that, we, given the rapid urbanization that we are experiencing, what is called the food crisis can only get worse. So I wanted given what people were saying, and just want to say thanks to all the presenters, it was absolutely incredible. For me, it's what do we do about this? What do we do? What are the strategies and tactics as we are living in the present, not in our visionary future world that we want, even if Ruth wants to say it's utopian, I think we can all get there. But what do we do in the meantime? How do we actually manage? What are the strategy and tactics? I think I can't. These I wrote this down, please. I don't even know where.
I think your main question was, how do we preserve radical women's knowledge?
Yes, that's it.
How do we archive it?
Yeah. Yeah, how do we preserve radical women's knowledge about the natural world as we are rapidly urbanizing, and how do we preserve and in a way kind of reclaim the ecosystems that are dying as we are rapidly urbanizing and industrializing? Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions, Lebo, that can follow that up, and then people, panelists can speak to all? I mean, many of the issues in the chat are comments. Yeah, mainly comments. So
yeah, I see comments rather than questions.
Yeah, people, if you feel I've missed out, please raise a hand or shout. This is a very open space, as you know, from the freedom that the hackers were able to enjoy. So yeah, I think just if panelists want to just speculate on that, how do we preserve radical women's knowledge? I mean, I think all of you have been insisting that women's knowledge at a number of levels is so important, inspirational, politically significant in shifting what we, away from what we now have. Just an open question. Shall we start?
Can I make an
introduction? Yes, please.
Yeah, I'll just be very quick. For me, this critical issue, I have translated it into the way I live. I got to a point in my life where I had to find a way not only to survive, but to thrive outside the system. And I come from a tradition that has critiqued commodity production. My PhD is on sugar production. And so I used the specific location that I found myself in, which is I live on a mountain with a small little bit of land that is arable. And I have spent 16 years retrieving women's knowledge around me, in the sense of using what women know, the women I know, growing indigenous healing plants that I can find, like African potato, for example. I have a corner of my field where when I can have access to indigenous bulbs and plants, I grow them there and I leave them in an ecological system where it's, natural as possible. So, and also I grow my own organic food, and I live as a vegan. And I know that we haven't talked about being vegan, because the claim of elitism has really shut the conversation down a lot. And also because eating animals, other sentient beings, is an addiction. It's a very, very deeply embedded addiction in us. I mean, when I stopped eating meat, I would dream that I was eating meat. It's so powerful, this industry of violence and trauma. And we have to start breaking into it, pushing against it. And for me, the alternative to disrupting the established systems of commodifying life is to actually step away from them. So I think for those of us, or let me rather put it this way, each of us, if we can, we need to assess the specific contexts within which we live, the challenges that face us, the sort of trajectories that our lives are taking, which we define, and then we try to translate the phases of our lives into lived feminist lifestyles. And for me, being vegan, working as an organic farmer, eating my own food, eating in season. It's hard, but it's part of the unlearning of the comfort, quote unquote, of a commodified life. And I really think this is really a crucial element in us making the break and making the shift. Because often we form organizations that continue to reproduce the system just in ways that appear to be different, but which are not actually different. And so we don't make an impact on the hazardous toxins that are destroying us, that are part and parcel of the larger commodified systems of capitalist extraction. Really and truly, I think we need to have the courage, find the courage to speak to the most radical expressions of the alternative as we imagine it in our specific locations, you know. Yvette inspired me when I went to her home in the Cape. And she has sage growing all over around her house. And sage is one of the most powerful herbs, the healing herbs. And I took a bunch of herbs of sage from Yvette's home. And that became a stepping stone for me to change my relationship with this amazing female herb. And I've used it in many ways in my own body and in sharing it with women who come in and out of my life, whom I love, and even healing men, in terms of reproductive challenges around reproductive health and stuff like that. So what I'm saying is there is so much that makes up the alternative. We just have to look for it and find it. And the solidarities that Ruth is talking about are embedded in the new possibilities of living differently and critiquing the systems that make it seem that, we cannot leave the norm. The other thing quickly is to step away from the market and to produce for our own lives. I know most people cannot do that because they need to earn a wage. But there are other ways of reproducing ourselves financially. Let's be curious. Let's be courageous. Let's find the other ways of making a living. There's so much else besides the capitalist norm. And that's where I would say we translate this very important and powerful imperative of safeguarding our knowledges, safeguarding our integrity, finding our new resiliences. But we have to do it. And it's hard, but it's worth it. And it's beautiful. And we get great pleasure out of it. And we strengthen our feminism when we do that. We make our feminism durable and resilient.
Thanks so much, Pat, for that response. I'm just thinking of the way that, it's related to the comment about solidarity and the way in which there's an incredible sense of inspiration and that one can draw from others. And I know that I have drawn that sense of inspiration from both you and from Yvette, both of you who, you grow, you produce food. And I'm wondering that there are other people in this room, not necessarily speakers, who might want to also speak to that. And I'm thinking, for example, of people like Pralini and Zayan. Hope I'm not putting you on the spot, but yeah, do you want to slot into this conversation at this point?
So you have put us on the spot.
You're on the spot. I don't want to, but I have.
Well, firstly, I just want to say that it's really been great listening to all of the speakers and just sort of, I mean, sensing that there's just so much power, so much going on, that we never hear about. And this is the reason we don't hear about it is because people who are doing the work and dreaming into life new visions and you know, and nurturing and putting food on the table very rarely, you know, will go, you know, look at me, I'm this big sorry, I'm just imagining a man with a rifle right now. And you know, that's been like sort of, even in the past few weeks, that's been the image that I'm seeing over and over and over again. And so very rarely do we see those, what we call those invisible hands that are doing the work of feeding, not just stomachs, but also feeding the imagination and feeding friendships and feeding relationships and all of those kinds of things, you know. And so even, you know, in this context of where we are looking at looter and looted, and you know, the pain around that, in the meantime, however, you know, there's this very real thing of people looking for nourishment, and of course on a very sort of primal level, it's been going into shopping centers and finding whatever is left after you know, after the braiding or bashing or whatever it is. But just in terms of my own experience, and I must say that you know, I only speak for myself here, but my own experience while people were barricading roads and things like that was that there were various women, and I have kind of single-handedly raised my children, and I've had to sort of nurture and protect and all of that kind of thing, right? So there were various women in my circle who have been doing this similar things, that were reaching out to each other in that very human way of, do you have this? I can give you this if you give me that. It was very basic thing, and it was nothing to kind of write home about, but that's what it comes, you know, that's the kind of reality, I would say, of the whole thing is mainly about caring, kind of a care, you know, kind of a care. And you don't really see that in social media unless it's trying to invisibilize another story. So you're finding a lot of the kumbaya stories coming out because there's now, you know, other things that need to be addressed, like racial issues. You know, racial issues have now come to the fore and they have to be addressed. But, you know, there's this other kind of story about we give food and we do this and we do that that's coming out. So it wasn't that at all, but it was just a kind of a reaching out and reaching in. Anyway, I'm rambling because I'm still thinking this through. And so thank you for allowing me to just think it through. It's just a comment and it's just where I sit right now. You muted, Des.
No, I was just saying thanks for that. For me, what's interesting and important is that you're drawing attention to the fact that the concern with food is inevitably linked to a certain ethics, especially for women who are positioned in particular ways within communities, within families, linked to an ethics of care, linked to reciprocity. And I think this is often what we refer to when we talk about alternatives. Because of course, what is mainstream, what is hegemonic, does not foreground reciprocity. So yeah, no, thanks very much for that. The other question that I saw was about the term sustainable development. Because there's a lot of terminology that's surfaced with the whole kind of let's resolve the food crisis. And one is sustainable development. And one of the comments, I can't remember who it was by, Pat Northover, was, the discussion so far, are people kind of in some ways echoing the ideas within the sustainable development paradigm? And Zayan's response was, that's an interesting question, but it's also very indicative of how naturally oral and practical lived solutions are then redefined. So I'm wondering if the panelists want to pick up on that in any way. The way in which the food crisis is being taken on in certain discourses and policy frameworks, and what that really means, and maybe with particular relevance to sustainable development.
Perhaps I'll kickstart, if I may, because I want to link into what Ruth spoke about, and perhaps just link it a little to the question that Vanessa asked earlier. So I think that it is important that we knowledge and how we defend knowledge, etc., and our indigenous knowledge and our systems of production, etc., we have to look at how we locate some of that within farmer movement, within peasant movements, and so on. For me, one of the experiences of the Rural Women's Assembly is this building of a collective bank, as it were, of sharing, of pulling together, of drawing from my mother's mother, etc., etc. We've been collecting, for example, I see some of my sisters are on the chat, but we've been collecting stories of seeds and how seeds are linked to ceremonies. So you can see this link between an organization, building movements, etc. So I think this for me is very critical. And linked to that is the way in which I think issues of whether it is organic or whether it is agroecology and so on in this country, in South Africa in particular, often it's the discourse around these important concepts is controlled by a particular section of academia. It's controlled by a particular section of often white activists, etc. And it's not located within the movements itself. If you look at, I was horrified within a very short space of time of setting up a network on agroecology. The organic producers were in there and wanting to claim it and marginalize small scale. So this is, and it's the same with sustainable development. And I think there's been a capturing of our discourse and of our narratives, etc. And so we constantly have to shift and to unpack the narrative so that it is, we move the liberal, or we tear the liberal wrappings from some of these terminologies. I think if we don't do that, we are going to continuously be on the back foot. Thanks.
Thanks, Mercia. Are there any other responses to that? I mean, personally, I must say that
yes, I would also like to respond. That was such a juicy question. I want to bite.
Bite away, Yvette. Bite.
Well, I just wanted to start by saying, and I'm so glad Ruth is sitting in on this, because particularly after I visited Nairobi, and of course, due honor to the late great Wangari Maathai, who started much of this, but I think in South Africa, we are landless, but we don't see land when it's there. Because in Nairobi, you know, they would have 3 nurseries at the roadsides. Every spare piece of land that I saw, somebody is busy planting a forest. Whereas, you know, I mean, I live in Gordons Bay and I travel to Cape Town. It's about an hour's drive. I drive past all this roadsides that is not being used except by, you know, okay, when you drive past Kailicho and Nyanga, there'll be somebody herding particularly Brown's farm, there'll be somebody herding some sheep and goats. But you see these absolutely insane carbon emitting situations where the municipality is, you know, shoos away the goats so that they can bring in men with machines to cut the grass, and you just go, yeah, okay, this is white supremacy at its maddest. So what I'm trying to get at is, even in the urban areas, we have so much land that we are not occupying, whether it's hospital grounds, whether it's outside the clinic, whether it's, Vanessa, guerrilla gardening. You know, there are very peaceful ways of occupying. We don't necessarily have to go there with 8047s, but we could plant a carrot or a tree. There are all the roadsides, which, okay, you know, might not be the healthiest of, I mean, well, mostly we don't have lead in our petrol anymore, but we could at least, even if we didn't grow food there, we could plant trees. There are streets and avenues and parks, and there's, you know, there's many cities, I think in South America, where municipalities have deliberately been planting fruit-bearing trees. Hunger is a social construction. We socially construct it because we walk past these empty pieces of land, but we South Africans don't see it as land. To us, it's, you know, if it's not like 400 hectares, it's not a farm. Vanessa and I shared this dream for many years of wanting to prove just how little land you need to farm on. As you know, I'm a hectare, and certainly if I were vegan, I could feed a family on this hectare. Apologies, Pat, but I want a cow. For that, I might need a second hectare. But this notion that we need big farms is very rooted in that kind of, you know, GMO, Monsanto, glyphosate type agriculture, which literally is, you know, that kind of commercial agriculture is mining the land, using fossil fuels and mining the land for calories. It's extractive. It leaves nothing behind. But that is related to its mode of production. We could, using intensive indigenous knowledge systems, kind of permacultures, you know, growing in 7 layers, we could probably not need that much land outside the cities. And we could let most of the planet revert to the wild and to the animals and the species. We don't need that land to grow food on. The reason why we are using it as present is rooted in that particular fossil fuel mining mode of production. It's not related to anything in the agroecology that necessitates huge amounts of land. So that's what I'm trying to say. I mean, I could go on forever, but that was the gist of it. I was in another Zoom meeting the other day with people that work at the UN, and they very delicately pointed out, this is in relation to the question on the food summit, that the UN has been practically non-functional through the whole of the coronavirus. And not, I do not want to distract us at this stage of the seminar, but you know, there are open questions around digital politics and what digital activism and what it really means. But I mean, the UN was pretty ineffective to start with, but this transition to Zoom has not done it any favors. So I don't really see much happening on that front until we can get back to like actual real meetings, which may be a long time, right? It's not going to be soon, certainly not 2021. So yes, if it's our choice of strategies of you know, why not grow a food garden outside the local preschool? Why are we not doing that? Is that not land? It's my question to all the South Africans, because like I said, to a Kenyan, and I'd like to hear his take, but to a Kenyan, that question wouldn't even make much sense.
Maybe I could follow up on that.
Can I say something?
I think Ruth is just, can you just wait until Ruth makes her point?
Okay.
This is Charmaine in the Northern Cape.
Yeah,
I've been to
Charmaine.
Limpopo, okay?
Yeah.
I've been to Limpopo about 5-6 years ago in Guyana, and their people is using the pavements to plant. So in South Africa, there is some areas where land is being used. And if you are the owner of the house and you don't plant, then the farmer or the person that is interested in planting will go in and ask if she or he can use that small piece of land and then give you some of the produce. So it is happening in some areas of our country, Yvette. Thank you.
Thank you, Charmaine. Ruth wanted to say something just before you spoke.
Okay, so I'll just very quickly respond to what Yvette said, but also link it to something I said in the very end of my presentation about cross-movement work. Yvette is right. Especially in Nairobi, we are very notorious for farming on every available space. The upside to it is that we have vegetables, for example, everywhere. The downside to it is that the vegetables are watered by water from very toxic sources. So that's another conversation to be had, but you're very right about that. But one of the most beautiful things that has happened in the last 2 years, in this country, in particular informal settlements, there's a very big problem with regard to police violence and murders of young, poor men. And with that happening, various communities came together to open up various social justice centers. And one of the most beautiful things that has emerged from social justice centers being run by poor and working class young men and women in some of the poorest areas in Nairobi is the fact that they've moved beyond politics of abolition, pushing for abolitionist politics, but they're actually now occupying MST styles, as I see someone has written in the chat box. They're now literally occupying every empty land they can find in Nairobi and literally farming using agroecological methods. And this is what I was saying, that some of the most innovative things and movements for justice or ideas about justice don't necessarily come from the traditional ecological, agrarian, food justice space. Some of these conversations emerge out of different movements. So that's something to think about. Also, as a final thing in relation to what Yvette and Mercia have said, I always say this, and I'm someone who has been very unfortunate to have to attend various UN meetings over the last decade because of work commitments. But one of the conversations that we continue to have, as you said, Yvette, the UN is ineffective now, but it has been ineffective for a long time. But this is a conversation to have. And this is a discussion that various movements within, whether it's in the climate discussion or whether it's in the CFS discussions around food, is the UN still an important site of struggle? And I don't want an answer to that. I think that's one of the conversations where, as individuals and as movements, we need to have, because we do know that even within the CFS, even with the presence of La Via Campesina, one of the most radical, food justice movements in the world, the co-option of radical language and radical politics still happens within these spaces. So that's a conversation to have. Are these spaces still important sites of struggle? And I guess in conclusion, for me, it would basically be maybe a response to Pat and the conversation about veganism. And I think this is a conversation that I've been in a space before where this is a topic that emerged. I think I'll say two things. Veganism is not inherently, how do I say this? What are the words for it? I would be cautious about stating that veganism is inherently justice-centric for very many reasons. But one reason that I really want to put forward is that we have to be careful to not impose particular cosmologies and ideas around what is ethical, what is moral with regard to food. Remember that indigenous practices and some traditional practices around spirituality, for example, relate with meat and meat products in very particular ways. In addition to that, industrial meat production has not always been the norm. This is a creation of capitalism and capitalist agriculture. And so I always say this, so this is what my thinking is that veganism is important. We definitely need to move away from capitalist industrial meat production and consumption. It is unhealthy for the body. It is unhealthy for the ecosystem and the environment. But this conversation is much deeper than two binaries, or whether everyone should be vegan or vegetarian, or whether everyone should eat meat. I think there's room for much deeper, much level-headed conversations. And as you've rightly said, there's always this very high, it normally becomes a very charged conversation, which is interesting because people come from the same direction in terms of we are all fighting for food justice or food sovereignty, whichever title that we have. It doesn't need to be as volatile, but there is room for much deeper conversations, and not just deeper conversations that respect different cosmologies and don't posit or just put in place ideas that what we have right now with regard to industrial agriculture or industrial farming has always been the norm. It has not always been the norm.
Thank you for that, Ruth. I think we are really starting to need to round up. So since Ruth's comments were posed directly to Pat, Pat, would you like to respond to that, and also by way of closing or rounding up, say some whatever words you would like to raise?
Thank you. Thanks, Des. Yes, I'm glad that Ruth has put the issue out there, because that's what I was asking for. I'm asking for a conversation, because for me, and I always make clear that I'm coming from where my subjectivities are located. So I'm not drawing a binary, and I'm not imposing some kind of an ethical standard that says if you eat meat, you are wrong, and if you don't, you are right. I'm posing the very crucial and fundamental question that faces us as feminists in particular, and that is the question of violence, and how violence is essentially embedded in who we have become as humans, and particularly the ways in which we as women experience it. Violence against other sentient beings is at the core of all the violence that we experience in our societies, regardless of whether there are cosmologies and rituals and ways of being that relate to other sentient beings in moments where the lives of other beings are taken. This is part of the human story, it's a part of the human journey, but they cannot be fossilized and made untouchable, particularly since we can see the ways in which violence has become so much larger than even those rituals and those particular reminiscences of who we were. So it's time for me, from where I'm located. I'm not speaking for everybody. I'm speaking for myself, because as a contemporary feminist, this for me is the most important. To bring my feminism to myself, and then to position myself and speak my truth as a contribution, not as an individualistic expression of who I think I am or whom I'm becoming. And often what happens is that in this experience of contemporarity, we come up against notions of the collective and of collectivity and collectivism that backlash, that object to this interiorization of our politics. And I see this, Ruth's comment, for example, as coming from a place where the collective is often prioritized above the individual experience, the individual experience of being. And it's a necessary conversation that we need to have, because even the idea of collectivism, even the idea of setting up organizations, of alliances, of solidarity, these ideas are embedded in discourses that in many ways have come to reflect the status quo. So if we're going to be radical, if we're going to be at the cutting edge and create new spaces of thinking, of being, we have to search and interrogate every single part of what we mean by being people of the present and the future, you see. And for me, veganism provides me that opportunity, that radical consciousness. It's a political mantra that I translate into my life, particularly in terms of stepping away from the market and from the violence that drives this market, which you can trace right back to the moment of surplus production and the commodification of human life. And so that's where I'm coming from. But I love it that we're speaking to it. And I hope we will have more conversations about it, that we will tussle and contest as we craft the alternative, because it's not ready-made, there's no formula. And we are so confounded by so much that comes from the place of capitalism and patriarchy, that shedding those skins, those multiple skins and layers of learned stuff that has become normal, even as we declare ourselves to be different, shedding it is going to be an essential part of the next journey, which we are already embarking on, and which, Des, I want to love you and put my arms around you, girl, for facilitating this, you and all the sisters who made it possible for us to begin to chew, as Yvette was saying, to take a bite and chew on these beautiful possibilities that are emerging as we take an alternative journey into our futures. Thank you for having invited me to be part of this lovely moment.
Thank you so much, Pat. As you say, the crucial issue is violence. How do we think about and how do we actually acknowledge violence beyond simply thinking about the difference between a crudely capitalist, obviously extractivist, highly toxic way of, kind of procuring animals, and something that seems to be very, very different. And I do know that there are lots of vegans, lots of vegans, at least 2 vegans, who would love to contribute to this, but I don't know if they want to say something now. But maybe just to flag that this is definitely a conversation that will spill over into the conference in November. So let's please think about that. Okay, Mercia, I saw a message from you. I know everybody has to leave, but just some closing words.
I enjoyed the space. Thank you. It was really good to be Pat, and I haven't seen Yvette and all 3 the panelists. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Very stimulating. Thank you. Thanks, Des, for organizing it.
Thanks. Ruth, I know you've spoken before, but you weren't aware then that it was sort of closing. Any comments? Okay. And then we'll move to Yvette.
That's good, because I was actually just typing. So thank you so much to everyone, especially fellow panelists. Thank you so much for organizing this. Thank you for the community, and I look forward to a conference in November and to engaging more.
Thank you so much for coming, for sharing, for your very, very rich insights. Yvette?
Thank you, everyone. Yes, starting a new discussion in the last 10 minutes of the seminar is probably not a good thing. So I'm doing violence to myself here, not to get into the okay, I will say a very little bit about veganism, just to I guess draw the lines for November and not keep you in suspense. And my position around it, and as Pat says, it's not a binary. I think the only thing better than listening to Pat is engaging with Pat. So you know, read my comments in that light. But just my personal position is just from a Khoikhoi perspective. You know, everything has a soul. So spiritually, I'm not able to make a distinction between eating a carrot or eating a chicken. You know, God made us in such a way that we consume each other. And the traditional Khoisan hunting tree expresses this very concisely. It says, give your life that I might live. What that inspires me to do on a daily, whether it is a lettuce or a lamb, is to ensure that life is not given in vain, and that I make every second count, just like Sisizani counts. That said, you know, on so many levels, it is a debate about this extractivist approach to agriculture as opposed to very traditional ways of producing meat. And I do want to say that from a climate change perspective, the most energy efficient way to transform savannas and grass into calories is through herding. And we've done it for 2,000 years at least. So the mountains you are moving are huge, Pat. You know, whether we should continue to do it and how it should continue to be done is you know, let us leave that for November. But I just venture to say that the question of veganism in a water-rich environment such as India is totally different from the question of veganism around huge swathes of Africa. I can in Cape Town, like I say, if I'm content to eat eggs, I can manage on a hectare. If I want milk, I need 2. And so to me, it's rather on that basis, on a very practical agroecological basis, that I think this will be a fruitful debate. So I will leave you with this note, that in my opinion, every white person should be vegetarian, just like every white person should lead all the climate change marches. When the police come for us, I want to see white people at the forefront, and that is where we place them in the climate change movement. So hope that keeps you till November.
Thanks, Yvette. Yeah, okay, everybody's saying sort of thanks and goodbye. But is there a quick comeback, or are you going to leave it there and pick up the conversation later?
Oh, I just love it. I mean, I love it because we are doing what we need to be doing, and we're getting pleasure from it, and that's gorgeous. Yeah. You know, so yeah, November, please come soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Okay, I think that's it. Lebo, is there anything pressing that needs to be addressed that I've left out?
Not at all. I'm just still glowing from all the ideas that have come forth, all the calls to action that we've been challenged with today. Community action, political action, scholarly action. It's a lot that we still need to do to climb this mountain. Thank you to the panel, and of course to you, Des.
Thanks to the panel. Thank you very much to the panel. Wonderful. And yeah, okay, I think we are all ready for our supper. Vegan or vegetarian or
meat.
Okay, thanks people very much for attending and participating, and this will of course be posted. We'll see what we can do with the hackers intervention. I don't think much, but that also says a lot. So yeah, and please do visit the website and keep in touch with what we are doing. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Take care, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.